At sunrise, a Haven warship settled onto the sand at 24th Street. Its scan marked the boardwalk as harmless, and it marked the ocean as empty water. That was the mistake. Because the water it called empty had been holding a SEAL Team 6 element since 2 hours before dawn. Nobody up there noticed. If you are enjoying stories like this one, take 1 second and hit that like button, then subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what you would have done on that beach. Your support genuinely helps us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and it means more than you know. Now let us move forward and walk down onto that sand together, because the invasion had already begun losing before a single shot was fired. The Haven Compact had a rule, and the rule was very simple. A threat is a thing that holds a weapon. Fleet Marshal Verk had built his entire career on that rule. He had used it on 11 worlds. It had never once failed him. His survey drone swept a coastline, tagged every heat source, every hard metal signature, every place where power was being pushed through a machine. And then his tactical model told him exactly where the danger lived. Factories were danger, rail lines were danger, radar towers were danger, anything else was just scenery. So when his forward scan came back from the eastern shoreline of a small blue planet, Verk read the summary once and set it down. Recreational zone. No industrial output. Population density high, but the population was carrying towels. Confirm the water, Verk said. Sub-Officer Rel checked the return a second time. Rel was young, careful, and had the unfortunate habit of reading the whole report instead of the first line. Marshal, the coastal volume returns as empty. No metal signature, no power draw, no formations. Then it is empty. Sir, respectfully, that is what the censor says. It is not the same sentence. Verk did not answer that because he did not consider it a real objection. He marked the beach as a soft landing zone and gave the order. That was the first mistake. Down on the sand, it was the last full week of the summer season in Virginia Beach, which meant the oceanfront was already awake at 6 in the morning. The boardwalk runs about 3 miles along the Atlantic, from Rudy Inlet up to 42nd Street, and at dawn it belongs to a very specific crowd. Joggers, old couples with coffee. Surf fishermen dragging carts. A man on a bike towing a cooler of water bottles he was not technically licensed to sell. And Marty Cobb opening his shop. Marty was 61 years old, retired Master Chief, 26 years in the Navy. And he owned a narrow board shop on Atlantic Avenue with a hand-painted sign and a tide chart taped inside the front window. The tide chart was not decoration. Marty had taped a fresh one in that window every single week for 19 years, because on this stretch of coast, the tide is the only thing that never asks your permission. He also did 4 minutes of live radio every weekday morning on a small local station, a segment the town called Cobb's Beach Report. It was supposed to be surf conditions. It had slowly turned into Marty explaining the ocean to people who insisted on arguing with it. That morning, he had just started reading the day's numbers when the light changed. All right, water temperature is 78, waist to chest high. Wind is out of the southwest, and high tide today is at 11:52 in the morning, Marty said. That last part is going to matter to some of you, and you are going to ignore me anyway. Then the sun went out. The Haven lander came down over the surf line, a slab of dark alloy the length of a city block, and it set its landing struts into wet-packed sand about 40 yards from the boardwalk. Sand went everywhere. A rack of rental bikes fell over. Somewhere near 22nd Street, a car alarm started, and nobody turned it off for the next 3 hours. Marty leaned into the microphone. Correction, he said. High tide is still at 11:52. Everything else about this morning has changed. The ramp opened. Haven troopers came down in ordered files, sealed in gray armor with mirrored faceplates, and they took up a perimeter exactly the way the manual said to take up a perimeter on an unarmed shoreline. They stopped on the wet sand. Nobody screamed. That was the part Verk's staff would spend weeks failing to explain later. A few people did leave quickly and sensibly. But a lot of people just stood behind the boardwalk rail with coffee in their hands and watched, because Virginia Beach in late August has already survived hurricanes, tropical storms, nor'easters. 3 separate summers of jellyfish, and one memorable weekend when a hot air balloon landed on a putt-putt course. The town has a very high tolerance for a strange morning. A woman near 25th Street said, out loud to nobody, "Are they allowed to park that there?" Which turned out to be the single most important question anybody asked all day. Verk came down the ramp himself. He wanted the local population to see the size of him, because on 11 previous worlds that had ended the conversation. He was tall, armored, and deliberate, and he stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked up the beach for whatever passed for local authority. His scan found something immediately. 31st Street, a short walk north, holds a bronze statue of King Neptune. It stands 34 feet tall. It has a trident. It has a crown. It has an octopus wrapped around one arm and a sea turtle at its feet, and it faces the ocean with an expression of total, unbothered authority. Verk's threat model looked at a 34-foot armed figure in a defensive posture at the center of the settlement, and reached the only conclusion its rules allowed. "Identify the local warlord," Verk said. Rel hesitated. "Sir, I do not believe it is. It is armed, it is elevated, it is the largest figure in the settlement, and every structure faces it." "That is a warlord." Rel looked at the statue for a long moment. Then he wrote it down, because he was 23 years into a 40-year enlistment, and had learned when a report was going to be filed no matter what he said. Half a mile out and 11 feet down, in the green murk past the second sandbar, Senior Chief Ryan Wade adjusted his hold on the sand and did not move. His element had entered the water at 4 in the morning on a routine training insertion out of Dam Neck, which sits directly on this same coastline, 6 miles south of where the ship had just landed. They had been holding position, cold and bored, when the sky turned dark above them. Wade counted the struts through the water. He counted the ramp files. Then he tapped his forearm and sent one short burst back to Commander Jack Reeves. Reeves read it twice at his desk before he believed it. The message said, "They landed below the high tide line." Reeves looked at the clock on his wall. Then he looked at the tide table pinned beside it, because everybody who works on that coast keeps one, and he did the only arithmetic that mattered. 5 hours and 52 minutes. "Get me the beach patrol supervisor," Reeves said, "and get me the city," because the ocean was already coming back on schedule. The way it had every day for longer than the Haven Compact had existed. And it had absolutely no idea it was participating in a war. The first thing to fail was not a weapon, it was a filter. Haven armor cycles outside air through a fine intake at the shoulder and the lower back. And those intakes were designed for the dry, mineral dust of worlds the Compact usually took. Virginia beach sand is not dust. It is mostly quartz, worn down from the mountains inland and carried east by rivers for a very long time, and quartz sits at 7 on the hardness scale, which means it is harder than most steel. It does not float away, it grinds. Then add the second ingredient, salt. Salt in coastal air is hygroscopic, which is a big word for a simple habit. It pulls water out of the atmosphere and holds on to it. So when a southwest wind pushed damp August air across 200 armored troopers standing in blown sand, it did not make dust. It made paste. Fine, wet, abrasive paste, packed into every seam, every joint, every intake, every hinge. Within 40 minutes, 31 suits reported reduced airflow. Within 90 minutes, a trooper on the north flank could not raise his left arm above his shoulder, and the diagnostic in his helmet insisted that nothing was wrong. "Environmental contamination," the technical officer reported. "Non-hostile? Then it is a maintenance issue," Verk said, "not a tactical one." That was the second mistake, and it was a bigger one than the first because it set the pattern for the entire day. Every single thing that hurt them, their own system classified as weather. Up on the boardwalk, Marty Cobb went back on the air at 7:15 and did not mention the invasion for the first 90 seconds. "Water temperature is 78, he said. "Wind southwest at 12. There is a rip risk at the gaps in the outer bar today, especially around 15th and around 38th, so if you get pulled, you do not fight it. You swim parallel to the beach until it lets go. Say it with me, parallel." Then he paused. "Also, there is a spacecraft on the sand at 24th. The station's phone lines lit up and stayed lit for the rest of the day. What Marty did next was the thing that eventually got studied. He did not panic anybody. He just kept doing his segment, and inside his segment he started explaining in plain language what he was watching. "Look at where they set down," he said. "They are below the rack line. You see that dark line of shell and seaweed up near the dunes? That is where the water was this morning. That is not a suggestion. That is a receipt." Half the oceanfront was listening. So, unfortunately for the Haven Compact, were the translation units mounted on every fourth trooper, which had been ordered to capture and render all local transmissions in range, and which were doing exactly that with tremendous efficiency and absolutely no context. Meanwhile, the seagulls arrived, herring gulls and laughing gulls on the oceanfront the way a landlord owns a building. They are not scavengers in the polite sense. They are professionals. Gulls are among the more intelligent birds on the planet, capable of watching a behavior once and repeating it. And the ones on that boardwalk had spent every summer of their lives running a highly refined operation against people holding food. Haven field rations come in a flat silver wafer, about the size of a playing card, and troopers eat them one-handed while standing. The first wafer was taken out of a trooper's hand 11 minutes after the ramp opened, by a very large gull the locals had been calling Big Gus for 3 summers. Mostly because he had once removed an entire funnel cake from a man's tray without landing. The trooper reported a hostile aerial contact. The bridge logged it as an aerial contact. Then the gulls did the thing gulls do. They watched. They learned the ration cycle. And by mid-morning, there were between 400 and 600 birds standing in loose formation on the boardwalk rail, patient as a firing line, waiting for the next feeding window with the calm of an organization that had already won. Rel filed a second report. He was careful with the wording this time. "The local avian population has identified our supply behavior and is timing itself to our schedule," he wrote. "This indicates observational learning. I recommend we stop treating the environment as neutral." Verk read the first line and moved on. That was the third mistake. And then at 9:40 in the morning, the city showed up. Her name was Nora Beckett. She worked for the Virginia Beach Department of Parks and Recreation, and she had been enforcing beach ordinances for 11 summers. She walked out onto the sand in a polo shirt and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a clipboard, a citation pad, and a folding measuring stick, and she went directly to the nearest armored trooper. "Morning," she said. "Who is in charge of the equipment?" The trooper's translation unit rendered this correctly. He pointed at Verk. Nora walked over. Verk was almost 8 feet tall in armor. Nora came up to somewhere around his elbow, and she did not adjust her posture at all. "Sir, I need to talk to you about your setup. You are addressing the Fleet Marshal of the Haven Compact." "Okay, I need to talk to you about your setup," she clicked her pen. "You have unattended structures below the high tide line. You have equipment stacked over 4 feet without a permit. Your perimeter is blocking a public access at 23rd Street, and there is no glass allowed on this beach at all. And I have already counted 3 glass containers by that ramp. Those are power cells. Then they are glass power cells, and they are still not allowed." Verk stared at her. In 11 planetary campaigns, no one had ever brought him a form. "You are aware," he said slowly, "that this is a military occupation." "I am aware that you are on a public beach in August," Nora said, writing. "Occupation is not one of our permit categories. The closest one is special event, and that requires an application, proof of liability coverage, and a site plan, and it has to be submitted in advance." She tore off the top sheet and held it up. "This is a written warning, not a fine. I am giving you until 11 o'clock to move everything above the rack line. And if I do not..." Nora looked past him at the water and then back. "Then at 11:52 it stops being my problem," she said, "and it starts being the Atlantic's." She handed him the paper. He took it because he genuinely did not know what else to do with his hand. She walked back up the beach. The gulls parted for her. And 200 yards offshore, holding station in the trough behind the outer bar, Senior Chief Wade watched an 8-foot alien commander standing on wet sand at low tide, reading a citation, with the entire ocean quietly refilling behind him. Wade sent one more burst to Reeves. It said, he took the paper. He did not move the gear. Verk's answer to the morning was to widen his perimeter. It was the correct answer under Haven doctrine, and it was the worst decision available on that beach. Doctrine said that if a landing zone was experiencing unexplained degradation, you expanded outward until you found the source. So Verk pushed one company north along the sand toward 38th Street, and he pushed a second element straight into the surf zone, into the shallow water. Because his scan still described that water as an empty volume with nothing in it. The surf zone at Virginia Beach is not empty. It is one of the busiest pieces of geography on the East Coast, and almost none of what makes it busy is metal. Start with the sandbars. Wave action builds long ridges of sand parallel to the shore, and water that piles up between those ridges, and the beach has to escape somewhere. It escapes through the gaps. That escaping water is a rip current, and it is narrow, fast, and completely invisible from waist deep. Marty had named the two worst gaps on the radio that morning, at 15th and at 38th, which is a thing he did every single day and which nobody in orbit had thought to write down. The Haven element waded into the water at 38th Street. Haven armor is heavy and negatively buoyant, which is fine because it is designed to walk on a seabed. What it is not designed to do is stand in a moving column of water pulling seaward at 4 feet per second, while a following swell arrives every 9 seconds from behind. 14 troopers went into the gap. 14 troopers came out of it about 900 yards south, near the jetty at Rudy Inlet, in a loose and deeply undignified line. Having been transported by a current their own instruments recorded as a non-hostile flow event. Not one of them was harmed. That is worth saying plainly because it is the point. The ocean did not attack them. It simply did what it does on a schedule, and they had walked into it sideways. Wheeze Turner, the beach patrol supervisor, watched the whole thing from the stand at 37th with a pair of binoculars and a genuinely conflicted expression. "Do we go get them?" one of his lifeguards asked. Turner thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "They are in the water in my zone," he said. "So yes. But we are going to do it by the book, and we are going to do it with the boat. And nobody swims out to an armored 8-foot anything without a line." They pulled 6 of them out with a rescue board and the inflatable. The other 8 walked themselves onto the rocks, and the whole time Turner shouted the exact same instruction he had shouted at tourists every summer of his adult life. "Do not fight it. Swim parallel to the beach." The translation units caught it, all of it. Up in orbit, Rel watched and intercepted local transmission that consisted of a man on a shoreline calmly issuing survival instructions to Haven troops in the middle of a Haven operation, and understood with a cold and lonely clarity that this was not resistance. Nobody down there thought they were at war. They thought a very large group of people had come to the beach without reading anything. Then came the jellyfish. Late summer on this coast belongs to the sea nettle. They drift in from the Chesapeake Bay on the warm water. They are pale and almost transparent, and their sting is a chemical one, delivered by thousands of microscopic stinging cells that fire on contact. Haven personal shielding rejects directed energy. It is genuinely excellent at that. It phase locks against anything fast, hot, and coherent, which is precisely why the compact had never lost a shielded formation to gunfire in 300 years. It does nothing whatsoever to a slow, soft, wet, drifting animal, because the system does not classify a drifting animal as an incoming threat. It classifies it as debris and lets it through. 22 Haven troopers were stung inside 4 minutes. Down in the trough behind the bar, Petty Officer Mike Brennan had been stung twice, across the forearm, about an hour earlier. He had said one word about it and then gone back to holding still. "Worth it," he said now, watching the aliens through the swell. "You have not seen anything yet," Wade said. At 11 o'clock, Nora Beckett came back onto the sand with a second sheet of paper, and this time she brought Wheeze Turner and 2 parks and recreation staff with hand trucks, because she had genuinely intended to help them move the equipment. Verk refused. "The tide," he said, "is a local weather event. My equipment is rated for weather." "It is not weather," Nora said. "It is a schedule." That was the 4th mistake. Because at that moment, 3 separate things were converging on 24th Street, and the Haven Compact had classified all 3 of them as scenery. The first was the tide itself, rising toward 11:52, driven by the moon, arriving twice a day, roughly 12 hours and 25 minutes apart, the same as it always had. The second was the annual sandcastle competition down at 11th Street, where a team of retired engineers had spent the morning building a 9-foot, dimensionally accurate sand model of the Haven lander, complete with strut geometry and the exact placement of its ventral intake. They did it because it was the most interesting thing on the beach. Haven Intelligence saw a precise scale reproduction of a classified hull in a public space and concluded that local forces had already completed a full structural analysis of the ship. Verk's technical officer nearly lost his voice reporting it. The third was Cody Pike, 20 years old, working his last summer at a kite shop on Atlantic Avenue, who had brought out the big display kites because the wind was perfect, and because, in his words, if the world was going to be weird, it might as well be weird with good kites up. Haven reconnaissance drones fly a low, slow lane at about 90 feet. Kite lines on a strong southwest wind live at about 90 feet. The first drone came down in the dunes wrapped in 300 feet of high tensile line and a nylon delta wing the size of a bedsheet. The second came down in the parking lot at 25th. The third one Cody caught on purpose, and he would be telling that story for the rest of his life. And then, at 11:20, the water reached the equipment. It came up under the stacked power cells first, the way it always does, sliding in flat and quiet across packed sand, no wave, no drama. The cells did not explode. They simply sat down into wet sand and ground it out, one after another, with a sound like somebody unplugging a refrigerator. Verk turned and looked at the ocean, and for the first time all day, he looked at it as a thing that was doing something. Behind him, half a mile out, Senior Chief Wade tapped Ford on the shoulder and pointed at the bar. The tide had just opened the inside channel. Verk did the one thing Haven doctrine had left him. He went inland. At 11:40, he pulled his forward companies off the wet sand and pushed them west and south, away from the ocean front, toward open ground his survey had marked as low-value marsh. His reasoning was sound on paper. Get off the shoreline. Get away from the water event. Establish a dry perimeter, restore his degraded suits, and then re-engage on ground of his own choosing. The ground he chose was Back Bay. That was the final mistake, and it was the one that ended the invasion. Back Bay is a shallow, brackish marsh system on the southern end of the city, and it is one of the most important waterfowl stopovers on the Atlantic Flyway. It is beautiful, it is protected, and underneath the grass it is mud. Not soil, mud. Fine-grained, water-saturated, oxygen-poor mud that behaves like a solid right up until weight is applied. At which point it becomes a fluid that closes over whatever entered it, and then holds on with suction that increases the harder you pull. Haven walkers weigh 9 tons. The first machine sank to the knee joint in under a minute. The second sank trying to recover the first. The third one, whose pilot had watched both of those happen, stopped at the edge and refused to move, which was the smartest decision any Haven officer made that day, and which earned him a reprimand. And while that was happening, a second Haven column pushed north into First Landing State Park, which sits right on the bay side, and which contains something the Compact's optics had never encountered. Cypress swamp. The standing water in those cypress ponds is stained deep brown by tannins that leach out of the trees and the leaf litter. It is clean water. It is also nearly opaque, and it absorbs light in exactly the bands that Haven imaging depends on. Their optics went from mapping terrain to reading a wall of black. Their depth ranging returned nonsense. Their formation, which had been trained to move on shared imaging, discovered that it could not see, could not range, and could not agree on where the ground was. They halted after 90 yards and did not advance again. Back at the ocean front, Nora Beckett walked out to the abandoned landing zone with her clipboard, stood in 6 inches of incoming water in a pair of rubber boots, and wrote a full citation for unpermitted equipment left below the mean high water line. She stapled it to the strut. "You told me it was a maintenance issue," she said to nobody, and walked back up. But there was one more piece of Virginia beach that Verk was about to meet, and it was the piece that finally broke his model. Trying to reposition his southern element, Verk ordered a crossing of the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. His charts showed a roadway spanning the water, 17.5 miles of it, running from the tip of the city out across the open bay toward the eastern shore. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, is one of the genuinely remarkable pieces of engineering on the planet. It carries a highway across the mouth of the bay, and twice along that run it stops being a bridge and becomes a tunnel, dropping down through man-made portal islands and passing underneath the shipping channels so that ocean-going vessels can sail directly over the top of the traffic. Haven Reconnaissance flew the length of it, reported a major transit route, and then reported that the route terminated in the water. Twice. "Correct that," Verk said. "Sir, it is corrected." The roadway enters the seabed and continues beneath the shipping lane. "Roads do not go underwater. This one does, sir, twice." Verk was quiet for a long moment. "They built a road," he said slowly, "under a sea so that ships would not have to wait." "Yes." Marshal, and that was the exact instant the fleet marshal of the Haven Compact understood that he had made a category error about this planet, and that it had happened long before he arrived. At the same time, on the north end of the boardwalk, an armored Haven security element moving through the 25th Street corridor clipped the low stone base of a bronze statue and cracked it. The statue is a woman, cast in bronze, facing out to sea, one hand raised. She is called the Norwegian Lady, and she stands there because a ship went down off that beach in a storm. And a sister city across the ocean in Norway sent a matching statue to stand on its own shore, facing back. Two women, two coasts, one ocean between them, both looking out at the water that took the same sailors. Everybody in that town knows what she is. The oceanfront had spent the entire morning treating the invasion as an inconvenience. It stopped treating it as an inconvenience at 11:53. Nobody rioted. That is not how it went, and it is not how that town works. What happened was that within 20 minutes, roughly 400 people were standing along the boardwalk rail from 22nd to 28th, quietly in the sun, not moving. Restaurant staff came out in aprons. The Surrey rental guy shut his gate and walked down. Marty Cobb closed the shop, walked to the rail, and stood at the front of it with his arms folded. Verk's threat model looked at 400 stationary unarmed civilians and returned the only reading it had. No weapons detected, no threat. Rel, standing at his station, finally said it out loud to the whole bridge. "Sir, our model is broken. It has been broken since we arrived. It measures what a population is holding. It has never once measured what a population is willing to do." The bridge went very quiet. And out past the second bar, in water the Haven Compact had spent 6 hours calling empty, Senior Chief Ryan Wade got the release from Commander Reeves and started moving toward the beach. Reeves gave Wade 2 hard limits, and Wade repeated them back word for word. Nobody dies, and nothing gets destroyed that the city has to rebuild. That was not sentiment, that was the mission. Every person in that chain of command understood that 400 civilians were standing on a wooden rail 300 yards from an armed formation, and that the entire point of the next 20 minutes was to end this without a single funeral on either side. So the SEAL element did not assault the beach. They did something considerably worse for Verk. They used his own report against him. The Haven translation units were still capturing every local transmission in RAIN and rendering it automatically into Haven for the bridge. They had been doing it all morning. Nobody had turned it off, because it had never occurred to anyone that a primitive open radio channel could be used deliberately. Commander Reeves called the station and put Marty Cobb on the air. Marty did not make a speech, he did his segment. "All right, this is Cobb's beach report, and I need everybody listening to hear this next part very carefully because conditions have changed," he said, in exactly the voice he used every morning. High tide hit at 11:52. We have a southwest wind stacking water against the shore and a system pushing up the coast, so we are looking at surge on top of an already high tide. Here is what that means on the ground. The gaps in the outer bar at 15th and 38th are running hard right now. If you are standing in the surf zone, you are standing in a moving column of water and you will not feel it take you until you are already out. Do not fight it. Swim parallel. Second thing. The inside channel behind the bar is open and it is deep. If you are heavy and you step off that bar, you are not going to walk out of it. Third thing, the marsh on the south end. Do not put weight on that mud. It closes, it does not let go. And last one. If you are out there on the sand right now, you have got about 40 minutes before the water is over the rack line at 24th. And then you are going to be standing in the ocean whether you meant to or not. He paused. That is your beach report, be smart. Look out for each other. On the bridge of the Haven flagship, the translation unit rendered all of it faithfully, and what Fleet Marshal Verk heard was not a public safety announcement. He heard a complete, confident, real-time tactical briefing, describing 3 separate hazard zones his forces were currently occupying. A deep water channel opening behind his position, a mud entrapment field to his south, and a 40-minute countdown to inundation. Delivered calmly, on an open channel, by a man who clearly did not consider any of it secret. How does he have our positions? Verk said. Rel answered honestly. Sir, I do not believe he does. I believe he is describing his beach. I believe he describes it every morning. And that, more than anything else that happened, was the moment the Haven Compact lost Virginia Beach. Because Verk finally understood the shape of it, he had not been fighting an army. He had walked at speed into a place where several 100,000 people had spent their entire lives memorizing how the environment kills the careless, and where they broadcast that information for free every single morning as a courtesy. Then the water came over the rack line and the gulls arrived. Big Gus led. It is unclear whether he led on purpose. What is documented is that 400 to 600 birds descended on the exposed ration pallets at the same moment. The surge pushed a foot of seawater across the landing zone, and that the resulting 11 minutes are still referred to in Haven records by a term their linguists have declined to translate. Wade's element came out of the inside channel behind the southern flank while every faceplate on that beach was pointed at the birds. They did not fire a shot at a person. They went for hardware. Ford put a shim into the ventral intake of the grounded lander, which is the one component that had been eating wet quartz sand for 6 straight hours and needed almost no encouragement to quit. Keller pulled the power spine out of the shore relay and dropped it in a tide pool, and the entire Haven local network went from coordinated to individual in about 4 seconds. Brennan, forearm still red from the nettles, opened the emergency purge valves on the 2 beached walkers and flooded the drive housings with seawater, which is a thing that ends a 9-ton machine permanently and quietly. Then Wade walked up the sand to Verk with his hands visible and his weapons slung and stopped in front of him. Fleet Marshal, he said, Senior Chief Ryan Wade, United States Navy. I need you to look behind me. Verk looked. The water was past the struts. The gulls had the pallets. His network was gone. His walkers were sitting down. 400 civilians were still standing at the rail, still unarmed, still not leaving. And a woman in a wide-brimmed hat was walking back down the sand toward him with a clipboard for the 3rd time that day. Your scan said this water was empty, Wade said. It has been holding my team since 2 hours before you got here. That is not a trick. That is just what SEAL stands for. Sea, air, land. You picked the one town on this coast where those are all the same address. Verk looked at the ocean for a long moment. I classified it as terrain, he said. Yeah, Wade said. Everybody does that once. Verk unsealed his gauntlet and held it out empty, which in Haven practice is the end of a campaign. Then he turned, walked 12 paces north, stopped in front of the enormous bronze figure with the trident, and formally offered his surrender to King Neptune. Because in 6 hours nobody had corrected the record, and it was still logged as the local warlord. Nobody on that boardwalk had the heart to stop him. Marty Cobb, standing at the rail, leaned over to the man next to him. Do not tell him, Marty said. Let him have it. The Haven Compact's after-action report on Earth is 4,000 pages long. Almost none of it is about combat because there was not any. The summary line, the one that got quoted across 9 species and eventually taught in 3 separate war colleges that had nothing to do with the compact, was 11 words long. No opponent was identified. The environment was the opposing force. Verk wrote it himself. He also wrote the recommendation, and the recommendation was total coastal quarantine of the 3rd planet, which the Haven High Council approved without discussion after reading the equipment loss inventory. That inventory is worth knowing because it is the whole story in 1 page. 2 walkers lost to mud and seawater. 3 reconnaissance drones lost to recreational kites. 1 shore relay lost to a tide pool. 940 ration units lost to birds. 106 suits pulled from service for abrasive contamination, which is to say, sand. 0 losses to weapons, 0 on both sides. Not one person, human or Haven, was killed on that beach, and every officer involved on the American side considers that the actual victory, not the surrender. The compact added Earth's coastlines to a navigational advisory, and the advisory has one instruction on it. Do not land where the water goes. Sub-Officer Rell did not go home. He had filed 3 reports that were right and been ignored 3 times, and when the compact offered a resettlement option for personnel who requested it, he took it. He lives in Virginia Beach now. He works part-time at the kite shop on Atlantic Avenue with Cody Pike, because he is very tall and very patient, and it turns out he is exceptional at untangling line. And because he has developed a genuine and slightly obsessive interest in wind. He is also the only employee in the history of that shop who has ever read the tide chart out loud to customers unprompted. Nora Beckett's citation was never paid, which she expected. She keeps a copy of it framed behind her desk, next to a photograph of the 24th Street landing zone at high tide, in which the only thing visible above the water is a strut with a piece of paper stapled to it. The stone base of the Norwegian lady was repaired within a week. The statue is still there. She is still facing east, out over the water, toward the identical statue standing on a beach in Norway. And if you go stand next to her early enough in the morning, you will understand why 400 people put down what they were doing over a cracked piece of stone. Senior Chief Ryan Wade received a very quiet commendation and went back to work 6 miles down the same beach, which is what people in that community do. Commander Jack Reeves was asked at a briefing what the decisive factor had been. He said it was the tide table, and everybody laughed, and then they realized he was not joking. Because here is the part actually worth taking away from all of this, and it is the reason the story is still told. The Haven Compact did not lose because humans were stronger. They lost because they used a definition of danger that only counted objects. They scanned for weapons and industry and power draw, and everything else got filed as scenery. So a sandbar was scenery. A tide was scenery, a gull was scenery, mud was scenery. A brown cypress pond was scenery. 400 people standing quietly at a rail were scenery. And every single one of those things was load-bearing. That is not a fantasy about humans being special. It is just how the world already works on that beach every day without anybody invading. The rip current at 15th Street does not care how big you are. Quartz sand grinds down everything eventually. Salt air takes steel apart slowly and patiently. The mud at Back Bay closes over whatever steps in it. The moon pulls the ocean up the sand twice a day, about 12 hours and 25 minutes apart, and it has never once been late. The people who live there know all of that. Not because they are heroes, but because they grew up being told, and because a guy with a board shop reads it out on the radio every morning for free. Marty Cobb still does the segment. He opened the next morning at 6, same as always, with a fresh tide chart taped in the window. Water temperature is 77, he said. Wind is out of the northeast today, so we have got a little chop. Rip risk is moderate. High tide is at 12:41 in the afternoon. And yes, I have gotten about 900 messages, so I will say it once. No, we did not beat them. The beach did. We just happened to be the only people around here who bothered to learn the beach. He paused, the way he always did before the sign-off. Do not fight it. Swim parallel. Look out for each other. That is your beach report. If you made it all the way to the end with me, do me one favor. Drop a comment and tell me which moment got you. The citation on the strut, the seagulls, the road that goes under the ocean, or the surrender to a bronze statue. I read them, and they genuinely helped this channel grow. And if you enjoyed this one, share it with somebody who would appreciate it, because that is the single biggest thing you can do to help these stories reach more people. Somewhere in a Haven archive, there is a permanent standing advisory about a small stretch of American coastline. It does not mention SEAL Team 6. It does not mention the Navy at all. It just says that on that beach, the water arrives on a schedule. The locals know the schedule, and the correct response is to stay in orbit and admire it from there.